Good afternoon, everyone. As Meg mentioned, I'm Genevieve Johnson. I'm the Acting Regional Director for Bureau of Reclamation's Lower Colorado Basin region. Thank you for joining us today for the first of two virtual public meetings on the draft environmental impact statement for post-26 operational guidelines and strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The Colorado River provides water for more than 40 million people and fuels hydropower resources. It serves as a vital resource for 30 tribal nations and two Mexican states, and it sustains 5.5 million acres of farmland and agricultural communities throughout the West. Prolonged drought conditions over the past 25 years, along with forecasts for continued drying conditions, have made the development of future operating guidelines challenging. And today we'll be providing an overview of a range of possible actions that could be taken to address these challenges. I want to thank all the reclamation staff, as well as the basin states, tribes, our cooperating partner agencies, and stakeholders who have worked diligently to develop and complete this work, hitting an important milestone in the process of developing and analyzing a new range of possible operations for the Colorado River. The draft environmental impact statement was posted on Reclamation's website on January 9th and was published in the Federal Register the following week. We will be accepting public comments through March 2nd. Today, we're looking forward to sharing this information with you and hearing some of your comments. Thank you again for your time and your interest in this important work. I'd now like to turn things over to Carly Jurilla, our Colorado River Post 2026 Program Manager.
Thank you very much, Genevieve, and good afternoon to you all, and welcome to our first of two public meetings on the Colorado River Draft Environmental Impact Statement. We are pleased to be here with you today and to hear your feedback and comments. Before walking through our presentation outline today, I wanted to just recognize all of the effort put forth by our team in developing this draft EIS. Many individuals throughout the lower Colorado Basin region that Genevieve runs and the upper Colorado River Basin region, in addition to our cooperating agencies, the Department of Interior's solicitors team, and our consultants, AECOM, and their sub-consultants as well. So it truly has been a team and a joint effort, and we're looking forward to sharing it with you today. Can you go to the next slide, please, Meg? As I walk through the presentation today, I'm going to be accompanied by two of my colleagues, team members, Alan Butler and Dr. Rebecca Smith. Both of these folks were instrumental in designing and implementing the technical approach that is featured within this draft EIS. So we'll be sharing the presentation today as we walk through the content of the draft. I will start with a background and then do an overview of the NEPA process thus far, talk about the purpose and need for action and the proposed federal action, describe the partner and stakeholder engagement to develop this draft EIS. I will then hand it over to Alan Butler to talk through the alternatives in the draft EIS. Rebecca will describe our approach to analysis and the environmental consequences, a high-level summary. I will then talk through the questions that we've received from you all upon registration and offer some responses, talk about ways to comment on the draft, and then we will look forward to your public comments for the remainder of the duration of the meeting. Next slide, please. Several agreements that govern the operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead expire at the end of this year. So our current operations are under the final year of these agreements. We have no agreements in place for operations in 2027, which commence as early as October 1st, 2026 for Lake Powell water year. The primary agreements are the 2007 interim guidelines adopted in 2007, Minute 323 to the 1944 Water Treaty with Mexico, adopted in 2019, and then the 2019, sorry, adopted in 2017, and then the 2019 drought contingency plans that were adopted alongside the other agreements in sequence to respond to changing hydrologic conditions that were being experienced in the basin, drought conditions that led to the decline of Lake Powell and Lake Mead to low levels that we've really been experiencing for several years during that period. This process is aimed to develop the successor domestic agreements for the operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The successor agreement with Mexico through additional minutes is being developed in a parallel process in consultation with the Department of State and the International Boundary and Water Commission. The operations and explorations we'll talk here are primarily about domestic operations. Next slide, please. This provides an overview of the timeline of our NEPA process. This began in June of 2023, where we published a notice of intent in the Federal Register to prepare an EIS, and that kicked off our public scoping period. We took in input during that scoping period for a 2 to 3 month period, and then published in October of 2023 a summary scoping report that contained our anticipated proposed federal action and purpose and need. Throughout the course then of almost a year and a half, we worked to develop a range of alternatives for evaluation in the draft EIS. In between that time, we published a report on the preliminary alternatives. That was in the beginning of 2025. And once those alternatives were developed, we then began to prepare the analysis in the draft EIS. Draft EIS was published in January 16, in the Federal Register notice, kicking off a public comment period that we are currently a couple weeks into. It closes on March 2nd, a 45-day public comment period, and then we will take those public comments and any other input received during that period and work to prepare the final EIS and publish the record of decision in time for 2027 operations. Next slide, please. The purpose and need for the action that this draft EIS is exploring is first and foremost, the key operating agreements for Lake Powell and Lake Mead expire in 2026. Federal law requires that the Secretary of the Interior coordinate the reservoir operations in the Colorado River system, primarily at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. We've experienced low reservoir levels over the past couple decades due to persisted and long-term drought, and increasing aridity is projected going forward. The current guidelines have not been sufficient to protect water supplies. We've had to adopt additional agreements in sequence during the term of the existing guidelines to be able to respond to changing hydrologic conditions. The new interim guidelines are needed to improve predictability, flexibility, and system resilience. And this draft EIS evaluates options to both balance water deliveries, impacts to environmental resources with the protection of critical reservoir elevations. Next slide, please. The proposed federal action first contemplates the adoption of new guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead beginning in 2027. The focus is the operations for Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam across a full range of reservoir conditions, both high reservoir conditions and low reservoir conditions, but does not preclude additional actions that may need to be taken upstream or downstream of these facilities in order to protect critical reservoir elevations. The action is designed to improve predictability for water users while protecting those critical elevations, and is designed to include tools and further use of tools and enhancement to those tools that allow for the storage and delivery of conserved water in Lake Mead and potentially Lake Powell to increase the flexibility to allow water users to meet water use needs. Regarding the duration, these guidelines are once again intended to be interim to gain additional operational experience for approximately the same duration as the existing guidelines, so roughly 20 years. However, they may be shorter in duration or phased as part of a longer term framework. Next slide, please. Throughout this NEPA process, there has been extensive partner and stakeholder engagement. Early input was gathered through a public pre-scoping effort that started in 2022. That led to the formation of the notice intent and the scoping period that then resulted in the publication of a scoping report identifying the proposed federal action and anticipated purpose and need. Around this time, we launched a public web-based, what we called Operations Exploration web tool to allow a tool for the public, our partners, and stakeholders to evaluate different operational alternatives for submission into the NEPA process. We also worked very extensively one-on-one or with groups of partners and stakeholders who submitted alternatives to better understand, refine, perform preliminary analysis of, and to take those concepts and incorporate them into a broad range of alternatives that are analyzed in this draft. We also very much appreciate the engagement and expertise of our cooperating agencies. These are the Fish and Wildlife Service, Western Area Power Administration, the National Park Service, the International Boundary and Water Commission, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We also have conducted consultation and coordination with basin tribes and are continuing to conduct that consultation and coordination throughout both existing forums and through government-to-government consultation. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Alan Butler to describe the range of alternatives that are included in this draft. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Good afternoon, everyone. So now we'll go through the different alternatives that were developed through that extensive engagement process that Carly described. Laid out here are the alternatives that were evaluated in the draft EIS. There is a no action alternative, 4 action alternatives, and then a comparative baseline that I'll describe a little bit more in the coming slides. What you will not see is a identified preferred alternative here. That is due to the current absence of a consistent based approach to the post-2026 operations among basin entities. We do anticipate identifying a preferred alternative after the draft that incorporates various elements or variations of these alternatives, which would be used to develop the preferred alternative and then fully analyzed in the final EIS. So we'll briefly describe the alternatives here and then go through them in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. The no action alternative is required by NEPA. It signifies a return to annual decision-making, absent any objective criteria, something that we've been purposely avoiding since the late 1990s. Next is the basic coordination alternative. This alternative was designed to provide environmental compliance for a set of operations that Reclamation could implement beginning in water year 2027 if no new agreements among relevant entities in the basin are developed. The enhanced coordination alternative was designed with close coordination with the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service. It also reflects concepts that we developed with the basin tribes and principles set forth by hydropower interests. This alternative is designed to achieve protection of critical infrastructure and then to also benefit key resources in the basin. Next is the maximum operational flexibility alternative. This was informed by a proposal that was submitted by a consortium of conservation organizations, and it represents and promotes maximum flexibility in water use across the basin. The final alternative is the supply-driven alternative. It includes Lake Powell operations that are based solely on recent hydrologic conditions. And then finally, we have the continued current strategies comparative baseline. It's not an alternative, but it's a set of operations that reflect a continuation of our current agreements. We've included it because it's a more informative set of operations for the comparative analysis of the other action alternatives. Next slide, please. So now we'll go through the elements and components of each alternative, starting with the no action alternative. The table lists the elements across the columns, and then there's details that we'll go through for each of those elements. Would refer folks to both the executive summary in chapter 2 for more details on these alternatives, as well as helpful plots, particularly for the shortage guidelines and for the coordinated reservoir operations and releases from Lake Powell. So for the no action alternative, the shortage guidelines for reductions in deliveries from Lake Mead. These shortages are determined based on Lake Mead elevations. They have shortage volumes of 400, 500, and 6,000 acre feet at elevations of 1075, 1050, and 1025. And the shortages are assumed to be distributed based on priority. For the shortage volumes in particular, and then also for the storage and delivery accumulation volumes that we'll get into in other alternatives, those volumes that are stated include assumptions for the deliveries to Mexico. Those are assumptions that were included for our modeling analysis, and as Carly described, they are subject to all the future negotiations with Mexico, with the Department of State and the International Boundary Water Commission. But the volumes are stated as a total basin volume to assist in understanding the total impacts to the basin. Moving on to the coordinated reservoir operations, the no action alternative releases 8.23 million acre feet unless more is required for equalization releases. It also can release less than 8.23 million acre feet a year once Lake Powell declines below elevation 3490 due to the infrastructure limitations at Glen Canyon Dam. That is something that's common to all alternatives, even though we won't restate it each time. As far as the storage and delivery of conserved water and non-system water, this is referring to what is currently referred to as intentionally created surplus, or ICS. The no action alternative does not include any new storage and delivery mechanism to replace ICS. There is, however, delivery of existing ICS in accordance with existing agreements. For the surplus guidelines in the no action alternative, they are limited to spill avoidance strategy, which is referred to as 70R, and flood control conditions. And there are no specific additional activities above Lake Powell defined in the no action alternative. Next slide, please. So the basic coordination alternative, which is the alternative meant to provide that environmental compliance if no consensus-based agreements are reached. The shortages in the basic coordination alternative are based on Lake Mead elevations, and they reach a maximum of 1.4 million acre feet and are distributed based on the priority system. We also identify conditions when additional reductions may be needed to avoid reaching critically low elevations. The Lake Powell releases are determined based on Powell elevation unless equalization is required. The releases outside of the equalization zone range from 9.5 to 7 million acre feet and can exceed 9.5 in that equalization zone. And once again, conditions are identified where additional action may be needed for infrastructure protection. Similar to the no action alternative, there's no new storage and delivery mechanism to replace ICS, but there is delivery of existing ICS in accordance with the existing agreements. And also, similar to the no action alternative, surplus determinations are limited to the spill avoidance strategy and flood control conditions. The basic coordination alternative does include releases from the upper initial units of the Colorado River Storage Project. And these additional releases are within the respective records of decisions of those reservoirs, contingent on hydrologic conditions, and the releases are meant to protect infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. Additionally, there are conditions identified when additional upper basin actions may be needed to protect infrastructure. Next slide, please. Moving on to the enhanced coordination alternative. This is the alternative intended to provide broad infrastructure protection, benefit multiple resources, and it was developed with several other cooperating agencies, tribes, and others in the basin. This alternative bases shortages on the combined contents of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Those shortages begin at a combined content of 60%, where they are 1.3 million acre feet per year, and then they increase linearly, reaching a maximum of 3 million acre feet if the combined contents is 30% or lower. And this alternative distributes the shortages based on pro rata. The enhanced coordination alternative has a unique set of operations or triggers at Lake Powell, where the Powell releases are determined based on a combination of Powell and Mead elevations, the 10-year running average hydrology, and lower basin deliveries, and they're intended to achieve a distribution of storage between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The releases in this alternative range between 4.7 and 10.8 million acre feet. This is the first alternative we've gone through that does include a new storage and delivery mechanism, or mechanisms in this case, to replace ICS. In the lower basin and Lake Mead, there is a storage mechanism in Lake Mead with a total capacity of 5 million acre feet, and then an additional 2 million acre foot protection pool in this alternative. And these volumes are included for the purposes of determining Lake Powell releases and shortages in the lower basin. So the stored volume is not what is sometimes referred to as operationally neutral. So it's aligned with how the current ICS volumes are included for purposes of shortage determination. There is also a storage mechanism in Lake Powell. This storage mechanism has a maximum contents of 2 million acre feet. It's included for purposes of determining Lake Powell releases, but it is excluded from shortage determinations. So the volume of conserved water in the upper basin or in Lake Powell does not increase or decrease the lower basin shortages. This alternative assumes that existing ICS immediately converts to this new mechanism, and it represents extensive flexibilities for the water users, including intra and interstate transactions within each basin, as well as specific inclusion of tribal water, both conserved consumptive use and unused tribal water for purposes of going into the Lake Powell Conservation Pool and the Lake Mead Protection Pool. Similar to the previous two alternatives, the surplus determinations are limited to spill avoidance and flood control conditions. And then the enhanced coordination alternative includes assumptions for upper basin conservation that is contributed to the Lake Powell Conservation Pool. These contributions vary based on hydrologic condition, representing realities in the upper basin. The alternative includes a sort of ramped schedule of these contributions where they have a maximum annual contribution of 200,000 acre feet per year in the first 5 years, up to 275,000 acre feet per year in the next 5 years, and then up to 350,000 acre feet in the remaining years, 11 and beyond. Again, those are the maximum volumes. In dry years, it's 0, and in wet years, it's those volumes, and it can vary in between 0 and those volumes. Next slide, please. The maximum operational flexibility, again, is the alternative that was based on a submission from a consortium of conservation organizations and represents the maximum flexible use of water within the basin. This alternative bases the shortages on a combined 7 reservoir storage contents, and then also makes adjustments to these shortages based on recent hydrology. The shortages start at 80% full of that combined 7 reservoir storage volume, and they increase linearly up to a maximum of 4 million acre feet. And as conditions, as the observed or modeled natural flow gets drier, they can increase faster. The shortages in the maximum operational flexibility alternative are distributed based on priority, as described in approach 1 of the supply-driven alternative, which we'll get into in the next slide. The releases from Lake Powell are based on the total upper basin system storage and recent hydrology. Similar to the shortages, if hydrology is drier, then the releases are reduced in different adjustment factors. They change linearly from 11 to 5 million acre feet with those adjustments based on hydrology. And once Lake Powell reaches an elevation of 3510 or lower, the releases switch to run-of-river operations, or essentially outflow equals inflow minus losses. This alternative also includes new storage and delivery mechanisms. The volume of storage here is specified to be 8 million acre feet in either Powell or Mead. Uniquely in this one, it can be moved between the 2 reservoirs, and the volume of stored water is excluded for purposes of both determining Powell releases and lower basin shortages. In this alternative, the existing ICS is converted to this new mechanism over a 5-year period, and it represents extensive flexibilities for all users with transactions within and across basins, including interstate and interbasin. The surplus guidelines in this alternative are limited to only flood control conditions, and there is a representation of upper basin conservation that goes into the Lake Powell Conservation Pool in this alternative. Those conservation activities average 200,000 acre feet, but again, they vary based on hydrologic conditions. Next slide, please. Okay, the last alternative is the supply-driven alternative. This alternative bases the shortages on Lake Mead elevation. They start at an elevation of 1145, and they reach a maximum of 2.1 million acre feet at elevation 1000 and below. The shortages here are distributed two different ways, then those are detailed in chapter 2. The Lake Powell release in this alternative is uniquely based on recent hydrology, and it's based on the preceding 3-year average natural flow and releasing 65% of whatever that preceding 3-year average is. It's primarily based on this because it's constrained to be within the range of 4.7 and 12 million acre feet. Like the previous two action alternatives, the supply-driven includes storage mechanisms in both Powell and Mead. For Lake Mead, it has a maximum capacity of 8 million acre feet and is excluded for purposes of determining shortages. There's a storage mechanism with a maximum of 3 million acre feet at Lake Powell. And the ICS the existing ICS is converted to the new mechanism over a 10-year period. It represents expanded flexibilities with interstate exchanges within each basin. While this alternative does include surplus determinations based on 70R, the spill avoidance strategy, and flood control conditions, it does also introduce an additional surplus condition or tier once Lake Mead is above elevation 1165. Finally, it includes several different activities above Lake Powell. First are the increased releases from those crisp upper initial units up to 500,000 acre feet per year within their respective rods. Again, contingent on hydrologic conditions and with the purpose of protecting infrastructure at Glen Canyon. There's up to 200,000 acre feet a year of conservation activity once going into the Lake Powell conservation pool. Again, that volume is based on hydrologic conditions. Unique to this alternative is the inclusion of gap water. When Lake Powell cannot meet its required water year release based on that 65% of the preceding 3-year average natural flow, this additional gap water is introduced in a constrained manner and tracked and released in subsequent years. Next slide, please. Finally is the continued current strategies comparative baseline. Again, not an alternative, but included for comparative purposes, representing an extension of the current agreements. So most things here should look fairly familiar to folks. The shortage conditions are determined based on Lake Mead elevations. There are shortage volumes of 400, 500, and 6,000 acre feet at 1075, 1050, and 1025. It also assumes a continuation or includes a continuation of the drought contingency plan and the binational water scarcity contingency plan, which includes those additional contributions of 241,000 acre feet at elevation 1090 and that increase up to 750,000 acre feet when you're at 1025 or below. And the shortages and contributions are distributed based on the existing agreements. Lake Powell releases are based on primarily Powell, but also Mead elevations. There are the 3 tiers that have releases ranging from 9.5 to 7 million acre feet, with the potential adjustment downward to 6 million acre feet for infrastructure protection. And then there's also the equalization tier where higher releases are possible at higher elevations. The existing ICS program has a maximum storage of 4.2 million acre feet only in Lake Mead. And it includes delivery of existing ICS through 2060 in accordance with the existing agreements, and also assumes that there will be creation of ICS continuing that reflects the recent historical use of the ICS mechanism. The continued current strategies include domestic surplus, 70R, and flood control, as well as the increased deliveries to Mexico per minute 323. And the continued current strategies does include releases from those upper crisp initial units within their respective rods based on hydrologic conditions and to protect Glen Canyon Dam. So with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I will start the discussion about how we approached the analysis of the alternatives. The first thing to know is what was the geographic scope of the analysis that we did. It starts at the full pool of Lake Powell, which is marked by Gypsum Canyon on this map, which can be found in Chapter 3 of the draft. That scope runs down the mainstream of the Colorado River, through Lake Mead, all the way down to the southerly international border with Mexico, SIB, which is at the bottom left corner of the map. We also included some service areas for lower division states water users because the economic impacts of water delivery reductions are of relevance to this analysis. Next slide, please. The technical approach to the analysis of the alternatives uses a decision-making under deep uncertainty, or DMDU framework. While this is new to the Colorado River Basin, it's a well-established framework in the field of decision science. And we didn't adopt it out of nowhere. We've been doing research for over 10 years into long-term planning approaches that could accommodate some of the challenges we face in the basin. The primary need for adopting a new framework is the extreme uncertainty in future hydrology. And despite many studies about how the future could play out, there's still a lot of uncertainty. And so to avoid overconfidently baking in assumptions about the future and hanging our hat on results that may not come to pass, we chose to use this DMDU framework. The key is that it tests alternatives in a wide range of conditions without locking in assumptions about the future at the beginning of the analysis, but we get to apply our judgment about what is most likely to happen at the end of the analysis, and lots of our results provide that opportunity. The focus of the DMDU framework is the concepts of robustness and vulnerability, and these colored rectangles just give a little bit of sense of what each of those concepts is trying to get at. For robustness, we want to know, do the alternatives meet key performance metrics in a wide range of potential future conditions? If they do meet our performance levels that we're looking for, we can say they're robust. If they meet them in a wide range of conditions, if they fail to meet them, we would say they're not so robust. And then thinking about vulnerability, what we're asking is, for situations where an alternative does not meet the performance level we're looking for, what were the hydrologic conditions associated with that failure? So rather than predicting a % chance of a bad thing happening, we're trying to connect the dots between what conditions occurred in the hydrology that were associated with the failure. For more information about DMDU and these concepts of robustness and vulnerability, you can go to Chapter 3, Section 2.6, and also Appendix E. Next slide, please. To ensure that we could perform our DMDU analysis well, we set up a modeling approach that uses a wide range of model inputs covering the set of important factors that affect performance. The first point is about initial reservoir conditions. So where are the reservoirs in 2027 when the alternatives or the new set of operations begin? We used 3 sets of starting elevations called high, mid, and low, and they were taken from projections that we made in October and November of 2025 of where the system would be at the beginning of 2027. This seems like projections from a long time ago, but it's important to remember that we started this technical analysis almost 2 years ago. So it's really key that we included a range of initial conditions because we were really unsure where the system would be in 2027. Unfortunately, we're getting more and more information about how bad the hydrology has been since then. And our current reservoir elevations as well as most of the projections we've seen recently have our starting conditions between the mid and low starting elevations. So the bad news is we're trending low. A silver lining is that our analysis for the draft EIS captures the fact that we could be starting low. Future hydrology is covered by 400 sequences or traces of flows input into the model, and they cover a wide range and variety of conditions. This thoroughly tests the system in severe droughts, wet periods, along with moderate hydrology in between. And I'm going to look at that a little more closely in the next slide. Future water demands are treated a little differently from the other uncertainties for our modeling purposes. In the upper basin, we use a single demand sequence in our model. It was developed by the upper basin states for the main analysis. And while it is a single sequence of demands that is input into the model, and the actual use modeled for those demands varies based on the hydrologic conditions and the conservation mechanisms. So we have captured some uncertainty and some variety in what upper basin use could be. In the lower basin, we model the full allocation or apportionment of 9 million acre feet being demanded, so to speak. That includes the lower division states and Mexico. And we don't vary how much they get by hydrology exactly, but each of these alternatives include shortage volumes and conservation mechanisms that impact how much water is actually delivered to the lower basin. So that's how we capture variability in demands in both the upper and lower basin. Also, we are simulating the alternatives over 34 years. So the simulation period is 2027 to 2060. This ensures that whatever the term of the new guidelines, we have long-term impacts covered. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I'm going to unpack the hydrologic uncertainty a little bit more. We used 400 traces, and they were drawn from 5 different hydrology ensembles. Hydrology ensembles are kind of groupings of traces that result from similar data sources and have certain narratives or storylines associated with them. The figure taking up most of the slide can be found in Appendix F, and it is looking at the specific statistics related to different lengths of drought. There are 5 different panels on the screen. The leftmost one is the driest 1-year volume. So what is the single driest year included in the set of inputs? The next is the driest 2-year volume. Next is the driest 5-year volume, 10-year volume, and 20-year volume. So we're covering both short-term statistics and longer-term statistics. And each of the colored rectangles in the panel represent a different set of the traces. So the yellow rectangle is, these are called box plots or box and whisker plots. And the purpose of them is to show a range and distribution of what is contained in any ensemble or in the full set of ensembles. And it's important because these traces are sequences over time, and they include a lot of different volumes. And so it's good to know that we're testing the system in a lot of different conditions. The yellow box is the full set of ensembles. It's 400 traces. And then the other 5 boxes are breaking out the individual ensembles, so you can see what each individual ensemble captures. They all include different important data sources. If you go to the appendix, or if you look really closely on your screen right now, you can see that they all have different names associated with the source of the data. And you can also see that they capture different ranges and extents of these different statistics. In each panel, there's a dashed line, which is marking the historical benchmark of what the driest X year average was. So, for example, in the leftmost panel, the driest 1-year volume, that dashed line is from 1977, which had the lowest natural flow volume at Lee's Ferry of about 5.5 million acre feet. I recognize it's hard to read all those numbers here, and it's not exactly that important, but the key takeaway from this figure is that all of these ensembles, and especially the full range that is represented by that yellow distribution box plot, have traces or have droughts that are drier and even much drier than what we've observed. And we recognize that it's really important to test the system in conditions that would be very challenging considering how we've had declining hydrology for a number of years. So this is only showing dry statistics. There are other figures in this appendix that show how we capture a wide range of conditions in wet statistics as well, because again, we wanted to test the system in a wide range of conditions and a wide variety of conditions. And what that allows us to do, constructing this set of hydrologic inputs the way we have, is break down potential system impacts by the hydrologic conditions that were associated with them. I'll show an example of that on the next slide, please. This is a figure from the executive summary that shows the performance or summary statistics in 5 key metrics from throughout the system. It shows comparison of the different alternatives, and it shows how these statistics or performance look under different long-term futures. First, I'll describe what those hydrologic futures are. So the top panel is the average hydrology. If we have the next 20 years are between 12 and 14 million acre feet at the least very natural flow. We call this average not because we think this is what the future average will be, but based on the statistics from recent years. On average, we've been between 12 and 14 for most of the last 25 years. Next is the orange panel. We call it the dry category. That represents if the next 20 years are between 10 and 12 million acre feet. And the bottom panel in red is called critically dry, which shows data if the next 20 years are less than 10 million acre feet. Those 5 key metrics are the percent of months where Powell stays above 3,500. That's a critical elevation. The next one across is the percent of months where Mead stays above 975, a critical elevation for that reservoir. And next we have the percent of years where we've avoided dead pool related reductions at Lake Mead. So these occur when there isn't enough water in Lake Mead to meet the downstream demands because it's near or at dead pool. The fourth metric is the average lower basin shortage. And the last one is the average Glen Canyon Dam water year release. Each of the alternatives is shown as a colored segmented line that crosses all of those metrics. Yellow for continued current strategies, red for no action, green for basic coordination, purple for enhanced coordination, orange for maximum operational flexibility, and the 2 blue lines represent supply driven with the 2 different ways of distributing lower basin shortage. Starting in the average hydrology panel, what you can see is that all of the action alternatives and the continued current strategies compared to baseline have a similar pattern where the lines are crossing toward the top of those axes of the first 3 metrics, which are related to reservoir elevations. Then they dip down and show an average shortage volume for 20 years between about 1.2 and 1.6 million acre feet. And then the shape goes back up a little bit to show that the average Glen Canyon Dam release is between 7.7 and 8.4. The no action alternative has a very different shape where those percent of months where critical elevations have been avoided, which are represented by those first 3 axes, are much lower. So it is hitting critical elevations much more frequently because of high lake Powell releases and very low shortages. And so what you see, one of the main features that these figures are useful for is showing trade-offs. And as very clear to see with these crossing lines between the 3rd and 4th metrics, because what it's highlighting is Lake Mead goes to dead pool much more frequently in the no action alternative because of those low average shortages, whereas the other alternatives impose more shortage and stay above those critical elevations more often. An average, quote unquote, average long-term future hydrology, a lot of the alternatives perform similarly in terms of avoiding critical elevations and imposing average shortages. As the hydrology gets a little drier, if we go to the dry category, you start to see separation between the action alternatives and as well as much worse performance in the no action alternative. So in the dry hydrology, you see that the enhanced coordination and max flexibility alternatives stay near the top of those first three axes, indicating that they continue to avoid critical elevations. If you follow the lines across to the fourth axis, you see that the lines dip way down and you get an average lower basin shortage of around 2.4 million acre feet. That is how the reservoirs stay high enough, is by imposing a lot of shortage and also having fairly low Glen Canyon Dam or Lake Powell releases. The supply-driven alternatives are a little bit less robust in terms of critical elevations, while imposing a little bit less average lower basin shortage and having higher Lake Powell releases. Basic coordination and continued current strategies have similar performance kind of in the middle of all those. Then in the critically dry category, all of the alternatives have unacceptable performance in terms of staying above critical elevations, despite even max operational flexibility and enhanced coordination imposing very large shortages. It's still not enough to keep the reservoirs in a good place. So what we've learned is, even with aggressive management of the system, we've modeled futures that are so dry that it is possible that we could go below those critical elevations. Next slide, please. The last set of results I'm going to describe come from two tables in the executive summary, and they are representing the near-term vulnerability for critical elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Even though we may get operations that go out 20 years, it's really important to understand what could happen over the next 5 years, especially because we're going to be, unfortunately, starting at pretty low initial reservoir contents. So these tables are representing, if we look at each of these alternatives and say, over the next 5 years, if they fall down to critical elevations, for Lake Powell, that's 3,500 feet. For Lake Mead, that's 975 feet. What hydrology was associated with those failures? The first, after you look at the colored names of the alternatives, the first column in the table is providing that average 5-year hydrology that's associated with the failure. So for example, continued current strategies, if we get a 5-year average below 10.9 million acre feet, we're likely to fall to those critical elevations. If it's basic coordination, if you get a 5-year average below 11.3 million acre feet, we're likely to see critical elevations, etc. And the red arrows next to each of the alternatives names indicate that under these alternatives, the system is vulnerable to conditions that have already occurred, and that is a connection with the red boxes. So if the alternative is likely to fall below critical elevations, under hydrology, we have already seen, it's important to know this, we can't predict the future, we can't say what the most likely hydrology is, but we can understand what hydrology can cause failures and whether we've seen that in the past. So for alternatives that result in vulnerabilities under conditions we've already seen, it's good to understand that and not use just a probabilistic sense of risk. These are facts on the ground, things we've observed, and a connection to what we know could cause vulnerability. For reference, the 2025 5-year average least ferry natural flow was 11.1 million acre feet. So a lot of these alternatives would be vulnerable, likely, if next year had a similar 5-year running average. Also want to note that this analysis was performed only using the low set of initial conditions, which are shown here, and those are pretty similar to our most probable projection from this month. So it's a good thing to keep an eye on and a good set of results to consider as very meaningful. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last thing to know about how we have tried to facilitate learning what the impacts of these alternatives could be is we created this draft EIS figure viewer. It's a website which is shown there. And what it allows you to do is go select up to 9 figures at a time from a drop-down menu. You can see them all on your screen at the same time, easily click on them to zoom in on them, see the figure descriptions. All of this is to help connect dots between different resources and different metrics, rather than opening 5 different PDFs and scrolling around between them endlessly. This is a place where you can go get that exact same draft EIS content really easily, just a few clicks. Another thing it includes is a link or images of the structure of the alternatives that Alan just went through, along with summary information that is also included in the draft EIS, just a few clicks away, so you can bring those pieces of information together. And with that, I will pass it back to Carly.
And I'll just note for everyone's reference, if you click on the chat button in Zoom, you'll be able to see that link that's currently on the screen and copy and paste it into your own browser or to save for your reference.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So the last thing we wanted to do before moving on to the public comment portion of the meeting was to respond to the questions that were submitted by you all when you registered for this webinar. We've consolidated the questions and summarized them into, I think we have 6 questions that we think capture the range of questions that were submitted by you all. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through them one by one. So the first one, the question was, how is the public input or the comments that are being received during this public comment period being handled and used? So all public input that's received during this public comment period will be first reviewed and organized. We would appreciate receiving comments that provide meaningful, substantive ideas or feedback related to the alternatives and or the analysis approach or results featured in this draft. And based on that input and those comments received, we will consider revisions and put those in our final EIS. The next question asks, how does the draft EIS address the need to reduce water use? The ranges of shortage volumes and conservation mechanisms that are incorporated into the action alternatives demonstrate that reducing use of Colorado River water is a fundamental component of responding to challenging hydrologic conditions and achieving a sustainable system. There are various substantive sections throughout the draft that describe how such shortage volumes and conservation mechanisms could affect particular water users under the alternatives, and we encourage affected users to review and provide us comment on those sections. The next question asks, how or does the draft EIS address assumptions about how water users could adapt to delivery reductions, for example, through compensated adjustments to agricultural activities, municipal conservation programs, or projects such as desalination plants? The purpose of the draft is to analyze how different Colorado River water shortage and conservation volumes impact resources within the geographic scope. The draft EIS does not incorporate specificity about how affected entities might adjust their own water use to adapt, and this preserves the flexibility for implementation. Reclamation is supportive of a wide range of approaches that water users may take to manage their individual situations. The next question asks, how will Reclamation manage reservoirs under conditions where Lake Powell and Lake Mead are falling below critical thresholds, recognizing that this occurs throughout the alternatives, especially in some of the very dry hydrologic futures? So the alternatives incorporate various mechanisms to protect elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead and describe the trade-offs with respect to these different mechanisms. Reclamation welcomes comments on these mechanisms, and for all alternatives and operations, the Secretary reserves the authority and discretion to operate federal facilities to protect infrastructure and respond to emergency conditions. The next question asks if the final EIS will include an analysis of the preferred alternative. I'm going to hit next there, Meg. So asks if the final EIS will include an analysis of a preferred alternative, specifically a consensus-based states proposal if one is received. Reclamation anticipates selecting and analyzing a preferred alternative in the final EIS. We've provided a wide range of alternatives in this draft and anticipate that many of the elements that make up a preferred alternative are represented in the draft alternatives in this document. And the final question asks if any of the draft EIS alternatives include constraints or on new upper basin uses, water uses, or if they require reductions in upper basin water use. The focus of the proposed federal action is operations at Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam, although this does not preclude management strategies that may include activities upstream and downstream of these facilities if needed to protect critical reservoir elevations. The activities that are contemplated and analyzed in the upper basin with respect to these additional strategies include releases from the Colorado River Storage Project upper initial units within their respective records of decisions and various levels of upper basin conservation. So thank you for your submitted questions, and we'll look forward to the questions that are submitted, and we'll provide responses on our next public meeting. So before we initiate the public comment portion of this meeting, just wanted to remind of the ways to comment. So during these public comment meetings, send an email to our project website. There's a telephone line, and we can also take mailed in comments. The address is provided here. All of this information is available on the website as well. Just a reminder that this public comment period closes on March 2nd. We have a project website that we've talked about, and another resource is the EIS draft figure viewer that Rebecca described. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Meg to initiate our public comment portion of the meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carly. Thanks, Alan and Rebecca, for that presentation. And Yes, as previously noted, we're going to be sharing a few of these resources in the chat since we know you can't click on the slide here in Zoom, but if you open your chat window, you should see the updated link for the figure viewer as well as how to submit comments, and you can copy and paste that information for your future reference. All right. We are now going to transition into receiving verbal public comments for the record. So let me orient you all to how that will work. So comments provided during this meeting will go on record the same way that written comments will and should focus on the draft environmental impact statement. We ask that you direct your comments to the Bureau of Reclamation rather than other commenters. And we will limit comments to 3 minutes during this meeting so that we have time to hear from as many commenters as possible. And of course, you have those other avenues available. If you have more than 3 minutes worth of comments to share, please do submit those in writing. And of course, I'm sure this goes without saying, but a reminder that this virtual event is designed to be viewed in homes around the country in real time, so profanity is not acceptable. So in order to comment today, we'll ask you to click the raise hand button in your Zoom controls. I know we have a couple of folks joining by phone, and if you wish to comment, you can press *9 on your phone, and that will raise your hand for us here in the Zoom meeting. I will call on everyone in the order you raised your hands, and you'll be invited to unmute. So you'll need to click the unmute to speak. I'll ask you to please state and spell your name when you begin your comment. And I'll start this 3-minute timer here on the slide for your 3 minutes to comment. So keep an eye on that to know how much time you have left. And then, of course, you can submit anything longer than 3 minutes in writing. So I think we already have a couple of hands up, or at least one. So we'll start there. Anyone who wishes to comment today, click that raise hand button, and we will work through anyone who has a verbal comment to share for the record today. I'll apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. Please correct me when you come on to share your comment, but I'll call on folks in the order I see them. So I have Ed Millard. See if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Ed Millard, E-D, M-I-L-L-A-R-D. My comments center around how the Bureau will handle conditions in which you may drop below critical elevations and protect your power head. I was pleased to see that run of the river is in one of the alternatives, maximum flexibility. It would seem to me like this should be the option of last resort when all else fails in all of the alternatives. And I'm sort of wondering why it's not. It would seem to me like if the Bureau is about to lose its power head, it is obligated to defend it because A, it can't let the turbine stop spinning. It can't stop river flows in the river because of the fish. And it probably can't rely on bypass tubes or outlet works to run the river because they're not intended for sustained use. So I'm wondering, is it possible to include run of the river in all of the alternatives for Lake Powell and model that? Because I would like to see how well alternatives like LROC and no alternative and basic coordination function as described, but they resort to run of the river as you approach critical elevations to defend your power head. In some respects, I would like to see a decoupling between the upper basin and Lake Powell and the lower basin, and just look at what it would be involved in using LROC, no alternative, 8.23 releases until you reach power head, and then switch to run of the river. And then whatever happens in Mead would be decided there as far as shortages and so forth. Again, it seems to me it's really important that you guys defend your power head. You just said you have obligations to defend infrastructure, and you obviously have to keep the flows in the river. And we certainly want you to keep generating power. throughout because we use WAPA power. So it seems like there's no way that you should allow an alternative to be pursued unless it's going to do the best job possible to defend the power head. And looking at your modeling, it certainly looks like max flexibility. Maybe it's for other reasons than just run of the river, but it looks like that is the best alternative for defending the power head, protecting your infrastructure, and protecting the fish. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much for your comment, Mr. Millard.
All right, next we have Ann Castle.
Hello. My name is Ann Castle, C-A-S-T-L-E. I don't have any comments at this point, but I have three questions. First question is, why is the socioeconomic analysis limited to just agriculture and recreational economics? And why isn't there an analysis of the economic impact on municipal and industrial uses? Second question is, why isn't there an annual evaporation charge on intentionally created surplus? There's a charge going in, a sort of system water charge, but no annual evaporation. And third and final question is, what exactly is gap water supposed to represent? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just as a reminder, we won't have live responses from the reclamation team today, but anything that comes through in these comments will go to that team for consideration as part of the comment process. Okay, next I see Daniel Herrera.
Hello, my name is Daniel Herrera, Daniel Herrera. I just have one question. In the Bureau's coordination and consultation with the tribes, has there been a consensus on which alternative distribution method works the best for said tribes? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next up we have Kendrick Newbecker.
Yeah, Ken Newbecker, Neubecker. And I just have what may be a dumb question, but I noticed the maximum shortages in the maximum flexibility alternative is 4 million acre feet, whereas in the supply-driven alternative, it's 2.1 million acre feet. And I'm curious why that discrepancy. That's almost 2 million acre feet between the two. And it just seems sort of odd that there isn't sort of a consistency in shortage, maximum shortage requirements. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up at the moment, but the floor is open. If anyone else has comments to share with the Bureau of Reclamation, we are taking them. Leslie James.
Thank you. This is Leslie James, Leslie James. I just have one quick question at this point. Will the rate analysis be available prior to distribution of the final EIS? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like that is everyone we have with hands up at the moment. Any others? All right. Eric Balkin.
Hi there. Eric Balkin, ERICBALKEN. I'm curious in the geographic scope of the EIS why it was cut off at Gypsum Canyon on the northern end, which is elevation 3610, instead of going up to elevation 3700. That's my question.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we have a returning commenter, so I'll just check if there's anyone who has not had a chance to comment yet who would like to comment before we go to anyone else. Gregory Boya?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Greg Bolla, B as in Bill, Olla. The EIS tends to focus on what to do for the changing supply. I was curious, or just had a question about the potential evaluation of efforts to, alter the supply of water in whatever way people can. I'm thinking specifically about the desalination plant in Yuma and any sort of lessons that we can glean from the efforts there over the last number of years. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, any others who have not yet had a chance to share a comment? If not, I'll go back to Daniel Herrera.
Thank you. Two questions. While many tribes have PPRs for their water allotment, is there anything being done in terms of infrastructure to be able to deliver this water to these communities that tend to have poor infrastructure and maybe not the funds available to take out said water? And the second one is, when and where will these questions be available?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Rin Tara.
Hi, my name is Catherine Tara. That's Katherine. My last name is Tara, Tara. I'm again have a question. Does Reclamation anticipate that the modified legal authorities required for the majority of alternatives will be in place and resolved before water year 2027 begins?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looks like we have one other person with a follow-up, so I'll just check if there's anyone else who has not commented yet who would like to comment. If not, I'll go back to Ken.
Yeah, my question, I had another question on the geographic scope. A couple of the alternatives look at releases from the upstream dams above Gypsum Canyon, like Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa and Navajo. And there's no look at what those releases, the impact that those releases would have upstream. And I don't know if those would require a separate EIS or if those are going to be considered. Because that would have impacts on the reservoirs and the people and communities below those reservoirs.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands up at the moment, but I know we threw a lot of information at you in a relatively short time, so I imagine you might be thinking. We are standing by if there are other comments. And I should have mentioned at the beginning that we do have the capability to receive verbal comments in Spanish. Our interpreters can interpret from Spanish to English so that Reclamation team can receive any comments in Spanish as well. So just let us know when you unmute if you prefer to share your comment in Spanish. All right. Not seeing any other hands up. The team will remain here standing by for any further comments. But this concludes all the information that the team planned to present today. So we will remain here to receive any further comments until the scheduled end time at 3 p.m. Mountain. And you can just click the raise hand button or press *9 on your phone to let us know that you have a comment to share. For those who might be about to sign off, just a reminder of the other ways to comment and that due date of March 2nd.
Thank you, Meg. And for folks that are still on, I just wanted to provide a reminder that we are recording all of these comments and questions, and we'll be organizing and adjusting the final EIS appropriately. For several of the questions that are really just seeking clarification on some of the approaches that we've used in the draft EIS, we will work to provide responses to those and post them up to our website. I know we're not responding to questions today, but I think some could be responded to with just some simple clarification. So we'll get that up on our website and send out a public email when those responses are available. So thank you all for the comments and questions so far.
Great. Thanks, Carly. And yes, thanks to everyone for your comments and thoughtful questions today. All right, looks like we have someone joining us by phone who has a comment to share. And I will enable you to unmute, and you might have to press *6 on your phone to unmute yourself. Listen and see what the instructions tell you.
Hi, this is Kathleen Marion Carr, Carr, and I'm hoping you can hear me. Could you please confirm?
Yes, We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. That was a very nice presentation today. So thank you for your time and thank you for organizing it so well. I was on the phone, so I didn't see all of your graphics, but I appreciate it. So my question is more of a clarification. So hopefully it can be responded to on the website. But the question is which alternative in the draft EIS does Reclamation believe is most likely to keep Lake Powell and Lake Mead above minimum power pool through 2050, assuming a repeat of the 2000 to 2022 hydrology, and why?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
got that.
Thank you.
As we approach the top of the hour, we will be concluding this public meeting. Thanks again for all the thoughtful comments. And as a reminder, there are several other ways to comment, including via email, CRB post 2026 at usbr.gov, telephone at 602-789-3889, or by mail to Bureau of Reclamation, attention BCOO-1000, PO Box 61470, Boulder City, Nevada 89006. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it to Carly to wrap us up.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you for all who joined us during this public meeting. And we really appreciate all your questions and comments. On behalf of Reclamation, I just want to thank you for your attention to this vitally important effort. And we look forward to future meetings with you all. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.